So we're going to start. Morning, everybody. Today we have Neta Bar as a speaker. Neta went to school, did her bachelor's at Beersheba, and then came here to do her master's, working on the reconstructing the tectonics and the static sea level together with Moti and Amotz. And then moved to Yale to pursue her PhD, and she will be defending it soon, working on a classical geological problem, also one that has high stakes and very heated debates, trying to really reconstruct and understand plate tectonics that are driving and have been driving in the Cenozoic, the landscapes of the Western North America. So we're very happy to have you here, and take it away.
Thank you. Just a quick, you hear me with the microphone?
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for the introduction. I'm going to talk to you today about a new way to view the tectonic evolution of Western North America, the recent tectonic evolution of Western North America. And as you see from my opening slide, I'm going to talk to you about the subducting slab. I'm going to start with a little bit of overview of general classical concept that shaped the view of this tectonic evolution. And then I'm going to present to you my new way of thinking of it, a new theory, and I'm going to show you a reconstruction. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to test this scientific hypothesis. And hopefully, by the end of my talk, you're all going to agree that this region is really interesting. This tectonic evolution of Western North America is really intriguing, and an important thing I want you to take of it is there's always room to reevaluate acceptable, long-held ideas and scientific theories. So I'm going to jump right in. The recent Western North America was shaped by a really long subduction, like 180 million years of subduction. But its recent tectonic starts about 30 million years ago as the ridge crest of Farallon and Pacific reached North America. So in this illustration, this is an illustration of the original work of Tanya Atwater's reconstructing the recent evolution. The Pacific Farallon ridge crest reached North America around LA about 30 million years ago. Tanya Atwater suggested that as this ridge crest reached North America, the San Andreas transform started. They envisioned the subduction stopped immediately as the transform propagated between two triple junction migrations. Mendocino Triple Junction and Riviera Triple Junction. They both migrated north and south. The San Andreas transform plate boundary opened up, and this plate boundary shifted pretty abruptly from subduction to transform. This idea was associated with the notion of a slab window. Dickinson and Snyder, pretty early on, sorry, I didn't mention that Tanya Atwater's work was in the 70s, 1970, was her original work. And pretty soon after, Dickinson and Snyder proposed that a slab window would form on the east side beneath the continent. So as the sun, I have a stick. So as the San Andreas open up and propagate between the two triple junction migrations, beneath the continent on the east side, a region of a gap will open up where a stenosphere will rise beneath the continent. They assumed that as the ridge crest reached the subduction zone, it will stop producing cross lithosphere melts and the sostenosphere will rise beneath the continental lithosphere. However, they didn't really explain why this production of melt or formation of crust will stop immediately after subduction. Today, we think that any divergence will actually produce an upward flow of mantle. Decompression melting will rise up and cool when you reach shallower depth. Another important aspect of the slab window, another important challenge for the slab window idea started early on in the 80s and 90s with seismic studies. So since the 80s and 90s, people started to map seismically the coastal California. This is a really early work from Irwin and Talwin from the 90s that showed two transects beneath California, two transects in central California showing an oceanic crust. So is there a window? Is there no slab there? These seismic studies continued, and a much more recent work from 2018 by Jean et al. Showed a tomographic cross-section all the way from the coast. This is around Big Sur, this cross-section, if anybody knows this. So really central California, and it shows a subducting slab or a continuous slab feature from the coast all the way to Sierra Nevada. If any of you heard of the Isabella anomaly, this is the Isabella anomaly, and Jean et al. And others argue that it's part of the Farallon slab. Another important issue when we talk about this tectonic evolution is pretty early on, from Menard in 1978, I think, people have started to recognize these local features in the magnetic anomalies offshore. So they started to notice these local rotation features they called microplates. We can see in the figure here, there's microplates, active microplates, north of the Mendocino fracture zone, where Cascades, where there's subduction, and there's some fossil microplates people have described, Monterey and Guadalupe. And in the beginning, people have suggested that these microplates are fragmentations of the Farallon that were formed because of subduction-related processes. So they envision, if you remember, that subduction stopped, the Farallon slab sank down, a slab gap opened up, and these little fragments of the plate rotated and then were captured by Pacific on one side. The blue bits are seismic anomalies that Wang et al. Is associated with these microplates. However, I'm going to suggest a different view for microplates. These little microplates are basically rigid areas of lithosphere that rotate locally compared to the major plates surrounding them. These microplates were also described in many mid-ocean ridges, divergence zones, like Eastern Islands and Juan Fernandez. In this example, these microplates are caused or formed by divergent processes. They start to rotate independent of the major plates, and they're bounding by two ridge crests. So two active ridge crests forming plates on both sides of the microplates, accommodating the rotation. The divergence of the two ridges is equal to the major divergence between the major microplates. If you remember, those little microplates I've shown before are actually being created between Farallon and Pacific. Just that, based on the slab window idea, the Farallon already sank. But it was a divergence zone. So I'm suggesting, why should we invoke subduction-related processes where we have a divergence zone and we have examples of microplates being created in divergence zones? Okay, so I'm going to recap later on, but another major feature of the Western North American tectonic is the basin and range. I'm not going to talk a lot about the basin and range, but I have to mention it in an interview about Western North America. This is a vast region covering much of the inland of Western North America, from the Colorado Plateau to Sierra Nevada, and it's been experienced vast extension. And the one thing I want you to remember from this is that the West Coast was moved westward about 235 kilometers from stable North America. So as this basin range opens up, the West Coast actually moves westward. This is a reconstruction of the opening of the basin and range by McKerney and Warnke from 2005, and I'm going to use this reconstruction later on, so I want you kind of to remember this. Lastly, for kind of a recap of these different concepts of the tectonic geology of the West Coast, is the coast ranges. A mountain belt created or seen along the coast along San Andreas. The uplift of the coast ranges was assumed or associated with changing plate motion, a recent change in plate motion. It only started to uplift about 8 million years ago. And it was explained or described as a wholesale shortening or a vice-like model deformation, which only means that the coast where the mountain is being created is actually being squeezed by two stronger blocks, North America from one side and Pacific from the other side. And for this model, you have to remember that people have envisioned there's a slab window underneath the coast, which maybe makes this area more squeezable. And there's an abrupt change between the subduction and the transform. However, other people have envisioned this uplift in more of a wedge-style model. Braun and Al suggested in 1995 that you could describe the uplift like a wedge, just like in any subduction zone that is formed by the traction on the basal shear. And if you remember from my quick review of the seismic data, it seems like there is a slab underneath the coast ranges. So there's really no reason why this slab won't accommodate additional convergence, just like a subduction zone. Okay. So in this setting, in this kind of a setting, the oblique convergence will be accommodated by a structure, the San Andreas on the upper plate, and the shortening and convergence component will be accommodated by subduction. This is really similar to other settings in the world where we see oblique convergence, like the South Island of New Zealand, the Alpine Fault, Sumatra, and Prince Charlotte, where you have a transform fault in the upper plate and subduction accommodating shortening, accommodating the shortening component. Okay. So I briefly mentioned 5 different concepts of tectonics that kind of form the view of this recent tectonic history. I want to recap them for just a little bit. So as I said, Tanya Atwater suggested there's an abrupt change between subduction and a transform fault. That idea led to the slab window idea. However, seismic refraction data, and then later on tomography data actually shows a slab beneath at least some parts of California and Western North America. I talked about the microplates that people have envisioned. They're fragments of the Farallon that connect to the slab window and abrupt change between subduction and the transform. I mentioned the basin and range and the coast ranges. two models for the uplift of the range. A squeezing vice model that kind of relates to the slab window idea, and a wedge model that may be related to subduction. Okay, so for the last 6 or 7 years, I'm arguing that there is a subduction going on underneath coastal California and western North America. I'm going to propose that the arrival of the Fairland Pacific Ridge is actually a transition from a fast normal subduction to a very slow, very oblique, but still subduction, with the San Andreas developing in the upper plate, and the subduction accommodating any convergence between North America and Pacific. And definitely, if you remember the opening of the basin and range, that would accommodate that opening as well. In order to explore this idea, I'm going to present a new reconstruction for the oceanic plates and microplates offshore and beneath North America. For the reconstruction, I'm going to follow some simple concepts. I'm going to go over briefly those concepts. So first of all, I'm going to assume that the production of oceanic lithosphere or crust-like material continues even after the ridge crest subducts. I'm not the first one to assume this. I'm not the first one to suggest it. People have argued and suggested it all along. I'm going to say that any divergence that's happening beneath the surface will cause an upward flow of mantle that will cause decompressive melting that will cool in a shallower depth. This will happen at least up to 200 kilometers of depth. I'm not entirely sure what would happen beneath that, but at least in the upper 200 kilometers, this process will continue and it will form a slab-like feature. Another important thing in my reconstruction is the assumption that the microplates have two bounding ridge crests, just like Easter Island, and that the fact we see a stranded ridge crest offshore doesn't mean that the eastern boundary didn't exist. So I'm going to assume that every microplate, the Monterey and Guadalupe, that I'm going to show you later on, have two bounding ridge crests that continue to diverge and propagate even beneath the surface. I'm obviously going to use the magnetic anomalies offshore in the Pacific and known surface rotations, and I'm going to assume that the slab subducts in rates that are compatible to the surface rotations we see of the divergent plates, at least in the horizontal. And an important issue I haven't mentioned in the introduction, is very important for my overall view of this process, is that ridge crests and slabs and subductions are really a part of an overall mantle convection. They're the surface expression of this three-dimensional process, and there's no reason to suggest that it will stop just because it reached the continent. So, under all those concepts and rules, I made this reconstruction, and I'm going to kind of play it around for a little bit, and then I'm going to stop and talk about it. So all these colors are really the underlying slab reconstruction of oceanic plates and microplates. The blue lines are magnetic anomalies of the Pacific that we know of. The cyan lines are the conjugate sets of these magnetic anomalies for a part of the Fairland that is called Vancouver. It is north of the Mendocino fracture zone, and it started to rotate differently than the central Fairland about 50 million years ago. So it's different color, it has a different rotation. The yellower lines are Central Pacific. They're the conjugate sets of what we see offshore they're Fairland, they're the conjugate sets of what we see offshore in the Pacific, south of the Mendocino fracture zone. Around 27 million years ago, so a little bit before this, Monterey started to appear. This is a microplate, a local rotation we see offshore Monterey. The conjugate of Monterey and Pacific we see from offshore. I had to guess where the eastern reach would be based on the reconstruction of the Fairlawn. The same thing I did for Guadalupe. In the green lines here, we have the local rotations of Guadalupe offshore, but I assume there's another eastern bounding reach between Fairlawn and Guadalupe. Based on the stranded western ridges, we assume these microplates were captured by Pacific. The Monterey around 19 million years ago and Guadalupe around 16 or 15 million years ago. At that point, I captured the microplate with Pacific, but continued the divergence in the eastern part. So I'm calling this Pacific, but remember, this is being created beneath the surface, just to illustrate the continuous divergence. Kind of summarize. Okay, so basically I reconstructed a continuous slab encompassing different plates and microplates. Another thing I really want to mention, maybe in the movie would have been better, but the different rotation between the Vancouver part of Fairlawn and central Fairlawn opened up created an opening along the Mendocino fracture zone. This would be important later on, but any opening would probably create melts and new forming material. So we have the microplates. An interesting thing to mention is that there's divergence going on today based on my reconstruction underneath really east, like this is Florida. So, but remember, this is a subducting slab. This would be very deep underneath the surface and might not have a surface expression at all. My slab reaches a lot further east than any other reconstruction of the Fairlawn slab because of the continuous divergence and forming of plate. Another way to look at this reconstruction is based on the age of plate, and you know, we could think of what does this mean, this younger plate underneath the surface for the surface geology. So just to note again, there's a continuous subduction here that is undisputable, and there's a continuous ages in these plates, and here we can see the effects of the microplates in the age of the subducting slab. Yeah, sure.
I know very little about this plate and all this, so I just wonder if you can go one slide to record. One slide to record?
Sure.
So the claim is that if you go a little bit backward in time, and you start to see the boundary between the yellow and the green. Is that...
You want me to go to the movie?
No, I'm talking about this point.
Okay.
So the idea is that at some point there is an extra ridge between the yellow and the green, which start to create microplates or something like that.
Between the blue and the yellow, the divergence creates a microplate in between. It moves and rotates between the divergence zone until it's captured by one plate, and the divergence continues. So the continued divergence I call again Pacific, but it could be whatever.
Is there a ridge in between them, or just part of the plates?
There was two ridges. There's a ridge here and a ridge here while the microplate is being opened or being formed. And then it's sort of an analog for really major ridge jump. The ridge jumped from where it used to be to a new position. Okay, so what do I do with this lovely reconstruction, if I can call it myself? I want to test it. I want to see how visible it is, how it fits with the data. There was 2 classical tests that were originally used for the slab window idea, in general for subduction, seismic tomography, which is a really an important tool today to image the subsurface, and magmatism, which is a classical test that was invoked to kind of straighten the slab window idea. So I'm going to start with the tomography. Following the early seismic receiver function data and the early cross-section, the black and white cross-section I showed from the 80s and 90s, in the, I think, early 2000, the NSF started this really major project called EarthScope. Within it, there was a seismic component that's called the USRA, which basically mapped the entire US with seismic instruments and created these great, vast, high-resolution tomography models for the entire North America, mostly US. So this is one of the earlier models from Goodrick and al. This is an MIT model that clearly shows there's like 3 transects along the west coast of North America, and it clearly shows a slab-like feature across the entire US. Of course, it doesn't look exactly the same. There's differences in resolutions and a lot of things, but there's clearly a major feature there. So some side notes about tomography, for those of you who are not exactly sure what tomography is. I'm not going to go into the method at all, just to capture what it means. It images the subsurface of the Earth. It's kind of like an X-ray for the body, right? But it really images velocity variations from an average model. The average model accounts for differences in depth, and the variations are faster and slower variations. These variations relate to temperature and composition. Basically, the faster, bluer anomalies are cold anomalies, and people envision that the slab, normally subducting plates are much colder than the mantle, so they'll be visible in the tomographic section as those blue blobs anomalies. But we have to remember that these are velocity anomalies or velocity variations, and they relate to temperature, but it's not a one-to-one relation. It changes with depth and with compositions and with other effects. Okay, so remember that capture about tomography. Now, I did a surface reconstructions, as you saw. I think I forgot to mention that I did the surface reconstruction in G-plate, if someone is interested in that. But those are surface or horizontal rotations, and I want to compare them to a 3-dimensional model of the Earth. So I need to kind of expand my surface model to a 3-dimensional model. So there's a few steps to that. I'm covering them, and I'm going to explain it a little bit more. First of all, I had to define the position of the trench, or a line in which on one part we're on the surface, on the other side we're starting to sinking the slab. Okay? So for this trench reconstruction, in time, I used what I mentioned occurring in Warnke's reconstruction of the upper plate. I'm assuming the trench just followed the coastline like today. So as you remember, basin and ridge, the central part of Western North America is opening up, and I have to follow this opening up for that trench line. Now that I have the trench line, I can calculate the time that passes for every point in the slab, the time that passes from when it passes through that trench, when it started to sink. I call it subduction age. And if you remember, a big part of my slab is actually being created beneath the surface. It doesn't really go through the trench. So the subduction age for that part is just the formation age, but I have to take into account the depth when it formed, right? Because it formed in depth. So there's a lot of calculation. I don't go all the way into them, but now I have an age that it's, every point on the slab started to sink, and I want to invoke or incorporate a sinking velocity on top of my horizontal velocity. Now, there isn't really an independent way to know the sinking velocities. There was a lot of studies trying to kind of average the sinking velocity based on slab features, but using those and comparing them to the seismic tomographic images, they don't really work. So I don't have an independent way of invoking a sinking velocity, so what I use is the seismic data I want to compare it to. So I took 5 cross-sections along the data, 2 north of Mendocino fracture zone and 3 south of it. And I try to follow the blue anomalies that I'm assuming are subducting slabs. I took their slopes and kind of calculated the sinking velocity. So when you look at, later on I'm going to compare to the seismic velocity, don't say, wow, there's a great fit between your model and the data, because obviously I took the slopes from the data, right? But what I want to compare later on, I'm going to mention it again, is this is the model, this is the seismic data, and what does it tell us? But for now, just remember, I use the sinking velocities taken from the actual images. Okay, I could take a break. So kind of an overview of how a 3-dimensional reconstruction would look like. And for me to kind of take my breath, catch my breath. So as I mentioned, it's based on surface rotations and sinking velocity. I'm assuming they're decoupled. Of course, there's probably some coupling for the sake of my model. The horizontal velocity and the sinking velocity are decoupled. It just sinks like Stokes' law in a medium. Oh. Okay. So what does it mean? How do I compare it? First of all, I start with the northern part, north of Mendocino fracture zone, where there's no contradiction. Well, everybody agrees there's a continuous subduction going on, right? So this is Cascadia, there's subduction going on, there's a continuous subduction going on north of the Mendocino fracture zone, and these are the seismic cross-sections from there. And an important thing to kind of note is that just south of Cape Mendocino, this transaction, we see a really nice, clear feature of a blue anomaly, blue anomaly describing a slab. On the northern part, this is where Eugene is, the blob seems a little bit different. And I want you to remember this when we look at this seismic tomography. There's no argument that there's a continuous subduction going on, but there's a gap here, and this feature is kind of spread out. So there's some limitations to the tomographic method that we have to remember while evaluating these ideas and models. These are the 3 transections south of the Mendocino. The first one in Guadalala is just south of Mendocino fracture zone, and it's very clear there's no slab gap window over here. This feature is very similar to the feature just north of the Mendocino fracture zone, a very blue, nice slab feature. This feature is where initially I showed you a tomography image by John et al. This is where Big Sur is, right here, and Isabella anomaly. And there's a clear slab feature all the way here, but then there's some gaps, some blue blobs, and continued. So obviously, the model is more continuous than the image. On the southern part, it's even less obvious. There's a clear indication of a slab in the upper part, but then there's some gaps in the image, some blobs along my model. So what can we learn from this? And what can we say about this test for the model compared to tomography? So a very important thing to remember, kind of mentioned it before and I'm going to elaborate, is that the seismic tomography is image velocity variation, which relates to temperature variations. And I'm suggesting there's a really hot, young slab underneath the surface. And we have to think, would it create a really blue, fast, cold anomaly if it's just being created, right? So that's one thing to remember. Will we see a really clear feature when we're suggesting there's a hot slab or a young slab or a new forming slab underneath the surface? And another thing to remember is that there isn't a one-to-one correlation between the seismic speed and temperature, and actually the ability of the method to see temperature is better in the upper part of the mantle than in the lower part of the mantle. So just for comparison, we maybe see a blue feature here and there may be a less blue feature here, but it might be the same temperature anomaly, but just the method is less sensitive to the temperature anomaly with depth. So kind of to summarize this part, I don't have a watch in. Summarize this part, I think there is a pretty clear indication there's a slab underneath North America, but definitely the extent of the slab, gaps, tears, and what it looks like is not entirely clear, and we have to think, what will we see in this method? What can it show us, and what we need to invoke a different method to kind of explore. Okay, do you have the time?
We have plenty of time.
I have time?
It's like 30 seconds. 10 minutes.
Okay. Okay. So another classical test that was mostly invoked for the slab window idea was magnetism. And I'm just briefly going to go over it before I summarize. The record of volcanism across Western North America was used to evaluate all kinds of features in subduction zones, like if you're familiar with the slab, with the flat slab, the laramite subduction. It was very much used to kind of picture and test subductions, and it was used in this slab window idea also. People early on tried to look for signs of this slab window. So starting from the 80s, Johnson and O'Neill followed some volcanic fields along California and suggested they propagate northward with the Mendocino triple junction. And they assume this reinforced the slab window idea, as you assume melts will kind of follow the edge of the slab, propagate with the edge of the slab. Wilson et al. Also did a synthesis of the volcanic data in coastal California and mentioned this northward propagation. Now, if you remember way back in my reconstruction, I mentioned the opening along the Mendocino fracture zone because of different rotations between Vancouver and Central Farallon. That opening also propagates northward with the Mendocino fracture zone, triple junction, and might create melts. So I mentioned Wilson et al. At 2005 did really a synthesis of the volcanic data and other aspects and kind of tried to see how it fits with or correlates with the slab window. And I kind of want you to look at his figures. This is a Monterey microplate. this is where he opened the slab window, which kind of looks like a ridge too. If you take my notion of how a subducting ridge would behave, his reconstruction and my idea are not so different. He's opening another part in the east part of the microplate. It's being opened up. I'm saying some melts are being created where it's opened up, and he sees volcanic indications of that. And another very important work that synthesized the volcanic record from the entire West Coast by McKerney and Oskin, they followed the McKerney and Warnke basin and range reconstruction and mapped on top of it the volcanic data set for the entire West Coast. They have a lot of different implications if someone is interested to talk about it later, but they definitely note they can see a slab window. But I want you to look at this figure and look at all the volcanic data outside their reconstruction. And also think about the way they reconstructed the slab window, and if you remember the big triangle that Dickinson and Snyder originally proposed. So a lot of people thought of this idea and kind of tried to match it to the data. And I wonder, is it really a good test? So I did the same thing, and I matched the volcanic record to my reconstruction. The underline is my slab reconstruction. The age of plate is important here because when it's really yellow, we're having really young melts forming of oceanic plates, and this is the volcanic data. And basically, what I take from this reconstruction is that the volcanic record is really spread out and might not be very significant to test these ideas, and I'll go into it a little bit more. This is 36 million years, way before the rich North America, before there's a slab window. There isn't a very specific feature of an arc, even then. You can call this the arc, but there's also spread out volcanism from the this fur line. This line I drew for the forearc. Again, this is where the ridgecrest reached North America, and there is a clear indication of a more denser volcanism going on closer to shore. But it actually starts before that. This is where people have envisioned there's a slab window underneath here. I'm saying there's an opening here, and there's some ridge crest here. And we have to think about what these volcanism mean. Is it a one-to-one correlation from the underlying process? Do we see the surface expression of magmatism right when we get the melts? Or do the melts actually evolve over time beneath the surface and erupt to the surface, controlled by other mechanism or local mechanism like the stress field in the upper plate and structural features in the other upper plate. This is where people have envisioned the propagation of volcanism along the shore, and just in general, how you see the connection between volcanism and my reconstruction. So, kind of to summarize this test, I'd say that melts actually evolve over a million of years in the subsurface, and they're influenced by the tectonic processes, but they're not one-to-one indications of the tectonic processes. And especially, and their ability to kind of erupt to the surface depend on other processes, more local processes like the upper stress regime, structural features, and other stuff. And definitely in this region of Western North America, where we had previously a normal subduction, before that we actually had a flat subduction of the laramite, I'm assuming there's a change between normal to a very slow oblique subduction. There's a slab window idea compared to subducted ridge crests. There's a vast extension in the basin and range. There's many, many processes that could evoke this volcanism. So how can we differentiate and kind of test specific tectonic ideas with this record? I'm suggesting in this part that we can't at the moment. If someone is interested, I'm not talking about it at all in my conversation, but given the composition of volcanism, is pretty ambiguous to these different ideas. Specifically, the slab window compared to subducted slab would create the same melts, basaltic mid-ocean ridge melts that will be influenced by the rocks above. So to summarize, I'm proposing this new way of thinking of the tectonic evolution of Western North America, that the Farallon Pacific Ridge actually represent a transition from a normal fast subduction to a slow, highly oblique subduction, convergence. And I presented this new reconstruction to kind of explore this idea. And I've tested it with two methods. I think the seismic tectonic method clearly shows a slab beneath California and beneath parts of Western North America. And then we could go into more depth debate of what does those gaps in the anomalies mean. And I think I've shown you that the magmatisms seem to lack the ability to test this theory, and we probably need to think about other tests in order to kind of differentiate between different ideas. Thank you.
Questions?
How magmatism works as a test in other plates and other places?
How does it work as a test?
Usually it's a good test.
So as I'm saying, I think in Western North America it's not a good test. It was used.
In other places. Overall over there.
So
it's a good test.
Well, the Western North America geology is, as I said, very complicated. It's very long. But specifically, like in South America, they use magmatism to invoke a difference between a normal subduction and a flat subduction. So they assume that where you have a flat slab, there's no volcanism because it kind of shuts down the mantle wedge beneath the arc. And then when it continues to be a normal subduction, melts continue. But in this region, they invoke it for the slab window idea, and it doesn't really differentiate between a slab window or a ridge crest. Also, there's a lot of other mechanisms happening in the same time. So we really need to think about, would composition be a good test? Would just the distribution of the magmatism would be a good test? Or is it really a problematic test in this region because you have multiple processes? Even just extension creates magmatism. You thin the lithosphere and you'd create some magmas, some melts beneath the lithosphere without any regards to the slab underneath, if there is or isn't a slab underneath. So there's really multiple processes.
More questions?
Yeah.
So maybe I didn't understand right, but are you saying that there's a divergence going on underneath Western North America nowadays, or is it just the slowdown of subduction? I was confused.
Yes, I am saying they might be, because as I said, my model shows a divergence.
Right.
But I mention it like an exclamation that I don't really know what's going on beneath 200 kilometers. Right. I don't know if the prolific of melts so deep might not be as much. Right. A feature might remain as mantle convection, or maybe that cell really shuts down at a certain point. Okay. But at what point in time will it shut down, the mantle convection? because the slab is still going down. There's
Yeah.
a feature. It's not like hanging in mid-mantle.
Right.
It's like a continuous feature.
People have suggested that the slab is slowly disintegrating and being delaminated, like pieces of it are being delaminated.
Yeah, so do you see pieces of it going down?
Well, I didn't see anything. It looks, it all looks like a Rorschach test, but this is it's in the literature, right?
Yes. So I think today the delamination part is not very well accepted.
Right.
Some people invoke this is a really slower. Some people invoke there's a tear going on where you see the redder parts. And what I'm saying is these tears are not a slab window at all. It has nothing to do with the western, with coastal California specifically, but even the West Coast might have nothing to do with this tears in the slab. And the general feature of the mantle will carry on.
Right.
So I'm saying the slab is not these drops of rock dropped in the ocean.
Right.
It's a part of a general three-dimensional system, and you have to account for that when you think of so you might have delamination locally, but the general process will continue.
Yeah. So a follow-up question.
Yeah.
There's a paper by Peter Copeland from 2017. You probably know it, geology, in which I think your test using volcanism and sometimes geologicity. But they keep on looking, they look at the extent of volcanism in Western North America, and I think that what they show there is that in the Miocene and late Oligocene, it progresses first eastward and then retreats.
So I would,
in a way following the shallow subduction of the Fallon plate, and it's draining.
So I would say no. So yes, there's papers like that, but actually that is a very old idea. It started in the 70s and 80s based on the volcanism, and it didn't account for the upper plate reconstruction. And McCurney and Osking basically show that part of that argument is not really true. They invoke a slab tear. They say that there's a propagation in the north part and not in the south part. And when I take their data set and put it on my reconstruction, or just some G-plate reconstruction for the basin and range, I actually don't see a clear indication for that at all.
Okay.
So there might be a gap where the flat slab was, but the propagation specifically is not that clear.
More questions?
Have you thought of using also on top of volcans, most other geophysical technique? I was thinking about USNT array, try to use magnetotelluric to see, for example, in Eugene, if you can see the slab in terms of resistivity factors and check the limitation of tomography, for example.
I haven't. I looked at some of anisotropy in tomography, like seismic anisotropy. They clearly indicate the flow that kind of follows the slab, but they don't really indicate the tears, or I have to have a better resolution. But that's a good idea to test. In general, in Eugene, there's no dispute about having a slab, and then you see in tomography that there's clear variations where there are slabs. The images are very varied. So I'm just kind of pointing it out as like there's limitations to the method. I still think it's the best method to see what's underneath. It's just we have to think about those limitations and what they mean.
It's not a simple interpretation. More questions? Anyone? Right, you're off the hook. Thank you so much.
דיברתי קצת מהר.
לא, זה יצא פה נמצא. אני טועה בכאילו... מה שחסר לי פה זה את הפנטזיה. מה יושב בקצה של האם את מדברת מצב שיש לך אזור...
סליחה, אבל למה חתכו חתכו?
אני אעשה ממש דחוף?
כן, עכשיו